Greetings, Acolyte, and welcome back to the Ordo Grigio, the Emperor's secret society against the enemy that is unpainted models. Today we expand our Imperial forces with some 3D printed Ogryns. Let's start with the 40mm bases we'll be putting these guys on. In the last video I built a ruined building for the city fight battles in the 40k campaign I'm running, and I want these guys to be used to defend these cities. So what better way to make them fit the terrain than to use the broken leftover pieces from the terrain build itself, meaning once they're on the battlefield they'll look right at home. Along with these bits of terrain I did add in a few other random bits from my pile, including broken pieces of failed 3D prints, chopped up lollipop sticks, and even a Deathguard shoulder pad. The bases I'm using have holes in them for quick slot minis, so I made sure to cover these holes rather than needing to fill them in later on. And I wanted to make sure that each base had a platform for the models to stand on, where they wouldn't look like they were skipping or hovering, or just look weird. Using the larger chunks of the wall tile helped here, as it would also give some depth to pin the models to. Once the glue was dry, I scooped out some Astro Granite from Citadel with a chopped up lolly stick and began pushing this into the recesses, building up that layer of rubble and gravel that accumulates during an urban conflict, and to help tie these bases even further into my city fight terrain. One side of the stick I left wide for scooping, and the other side was quite pointy for the detailed pushing and poking needed to get into the nooks and crannies. However, I didn't need to worry too much about being neat here, as rubble isn't exactly perfectly placed. Then I pinned the models to the bases, except the Ogryn with a small section of upright wall, and gave them all a zenithal black-grey prime, mostly so I could see the detail on the models as I begin painting them. Bugman's Glow was the first paint I used on these models. Being that the skin is such a large portion of the model, I wanted to start there as it would really help distinguish the model from its prime and help bring it to life. My silicon Spider-Man palette comes out again so I can have a consistent paint mix across the models. And I'm running with fairly thin paint here, probably around 50-50 water to paint, to really help it flow across the model for a nice smooth finish, while still allowing for the shading of the prime to show through. For a free STL file, I have to say these are really well designed models, and actually come with head and body options, so they can be customised. However, I went with 3 of the pre-posed and assembled models for speed of printing. I did however have a semi-failure on the models on their boots where the armour sections failed to print, but this left a ragged cloth looking texture, so rather than reprint the models, I leaned into this and decided to have them as cloth wraps in place of boots. As you can see, with just one paint the models really come to life, especially the angry one, who I'm pretty sure just realised how much Games Workshop charge for a box of 3 Ogryns. Wild Rider Red next to add an industrial feel to the model by painting their trousers a bright industrial orange. I chose this colour because on Garbatia, the world where the campaign takes place, Ogryns and other abhumans are pretty much used as slave labour in the manufactorums and factory habs, where their sheer bulk and low intellect are taken advantage of to move and operate heavy but simple machinery. However, in times of conflict, much like the human workers, they are pressed into military service with basic gear and forced to fight for the Imperium. Also, with a lot of greens and greys, I wanted them to stand out from the urban bases, so a nice bright colour would help with that. To start the armour, I applied a Vallejo Model Air Russian Green across all the weapons and the armour, as well as some of the floor and wall sections on the bases, matching the colour scheme of the ruins in the last video. Being an airbrush paint, this didn't need any thinning at all, and still took a couple of layers to apply in a smooth coat, especially on the flatter surfaces of the armour, but again, with any base coat I do, it doesn't need to be perfect, as it will be washed and highlighted later on. I really wanted the armour and weapons to feel different than the rest of the Ogryns' equipment, to further reinforce the feeling that this was an industrial worker quickly issued military gear and forced to defend their home against invading forces, whether they be Chaos, Eldar, Tyranids, Orcs, or even other Imperial factions. Not Tau though, they're just fish. Then I used Macragge Blue for the rubber component of the respirators the Ogryns wore. I actually based this colour scheme on the half mask I use when I'm airbrushing models, and again this was to enhance the industrial feel, as they would still likely utilise PPE they already had from working in the manufactorums. Again, this paint was mixed about 50-50 with water, as with most layers I do, to help it apply smoothly, but still retain decent coverage. Any more than 50-50 and it tends to run and pool on the model, acting more like a wash than an acrylic paint. Army paint as leather brown next for the leather. Shocking, I know. I started with the belts and found that the 50-50 mix with the army painter tends to act differently and was more translucent than the paints from Citadel's base range, though the coverage was still acceptable. I then moved on to the wraps that formed the Ogryns boots, where the extra flow from the army painter paint helped get the colour into the texture of the model. Pretty handy when this is the part where the print failed on it. I also applied this to the piece of wood on the base, and the models are really coming together now, being almost done with the base colours on the model. Zandri Dust from Citadel next to pick out the stocks of the weapons. I wasn't really sure what to do with these, as they were a rather large flat detail on the model, but picking them out in a different colour than the rest of the weapon made sense to me, so that's what I did. I also used this to pick out the interior of the wall section, to paint it similar to the interiors of the ruins from the last video. Army painter's matte black next to pick out a few of the smaller details, like the canisters of the respirators and the pistol grips of the rifles. I used the thinness of the army painter paints to my advantage here, so the paint wouldn't settle on the edges as much as with Citadel paints, adding a bit of depth to the model before we apply any washes. I did also paint the exposed belt buckle, but I ended up going over it in the next step. While the black was out, I took plate mail metal and mixed it into the matte black, a recipe I developed on my Blood Angel Plague Marines, though I might have went a little too dark on these guys. I wanted a very dark metallic for the weapons of the Ogryns, as I wanted their military gear to be fairly reminiscent of the military equipment used in the early 2000s, like the SA-80 assault rifle, where the metal parts are painted black to reduce shine and reflection, but over time they wear and slight metallic can be seen. The last step before washes were applied was using Celestra Grey to pick out the Aquilas on the chest of the Ogryns armour. I kept my 50-50 water paint mix here, and just rubbed the brush on it a little, as I didn't want to make any mistakes that would require any more cleanup than I already had to do. Next I used Nuln Oil, a black wash from Citadel, and applied it generously over the entire model and base. By using black across the whole model, it unifies some of the more contrasting colours, and also adds a level of grime and dirtiness to the model. Similar effects can be used with other products like streaking grime, however, I have Nuln Oil, and with the dirt and rubble being predominantly greys and blacks, a blackish layer of filth seemed appropriate. Now that the wash has dried, it's time to start on the highlights and really lift these models. Bugman's Glow comes back out for the skin areas on the model, thinned slightly more than 50-50 with water, and I work my way around the model, picking out the raised areas. This is where the successes and failures of a model will show through, as a well-sculpted model will be much easier to pick out the details like this when painting, and these models did not disappoint. Normally I struggle with skin and faces, but the oversized, over-exaggerated folds and bulges here were really easy to pick out and highlight, re-establishing the colour and further separating the raised flesh from the dirty, dark recesses. By thinning the paints slightly more, I am able to come in and do a second pass on areas, building a smoother transition towards the top of the model, really selling the flesh of the model as being something real rather than just a painted model. Pretty handy on a bald head too. It's also worth noting here that when you apply the paint, it will look more dramatic while it's wet, but as the paint dries, the effect will soften and look more natural. The same process is followed with Wild Rider Red for the folds of the trousers, thinning it down and picking out the raised areas, By choosing a brighter colour to start with, and then a very heavy wash, we can get a vibrant colour with a fairly smooth transition, without resorting to blending, glazing, or mixing paints together, though paint consistency is the key here, and if the paint's too thick, the highlights will be harsher than desired, though that can be an entire style in itself. As is, this is a good compromise between grimdark battle and bright contrasting colours detectable from a tabletop away. I use Rakarth Flesh next for a scratchy highlight on the stocks of the weapons. My thinking here would be that a harsh, stark, contrasting highlight would make the object look more solid and less organic than the skin and the cloth that we've painted so far. However, it didn't really go to plan on the first stock I painted. I covered way too much of the surface with the scratches and should have stopped way sooner than I did. Though this is one of the benefits of trying new ideas, you can make mistakes, analyse what went wrong, find a way to fix it, and improve on your painting. By the time I reached the third model, I think I achieved a much better effect, which made the object look worn, discoloured, and used, but it wasn't over the top and remained fairly subtle once dried. Following the highlighting pattern, leather brown was used to highlight the leather of the belts, taking my learnings from the mistakes on the gun stocks. I used a mix of edge highlighting and scratching highlights, using the scratches here to try and add some texture to the flat surface of the belt, as leather is rarely uniform and flat like it is on the model. Though I did want some areas, particularly on the backs, to look smoother, following the shading of the wash to emphasise the shape rather than dictate it in these areas. I then thinned the paint even further to glaze over the weapon stocks, especially the one which I did a little bit wrong. This was to bring some warmth to the Rakarth Flesh and tone down the pale colour just a little bit. Taking a break from highlights, I used Dawnstone to dry brush the bases. However, it was far too subtle and close to what the base already looked like, so I scrapped the Dawnstone and brought out Celestra Grey. Pretty sure I did this exact step the exact way when painting the ruins. Guess I didn't really learn my lesson. This new improved grey really brought out the texture of the base and the astrogranite that I'd applied to it, and I also pulled it up onto the boots and leather wrapping to give them a dusty appearance and tie the model into its environment. Too often I've painted models and left them totally separate from their bases, and it always leaves the model feeling weird, like it's just landed in the world pristine and ready to go, rather than a warrior in a firefight that's dragged on for hours or even days. For the armour, I used Citadel's Deathguard Green to layer onto the large flat areas of the armour and weapons. On the more detailed and smaller panels, I could do a layer which faded to the brighter colour. However, for the large playing part of the chest plate, I wasn't getting along with the transition, so I left it quite opaque in the end. I began running the brush along some of the raised edges to form a sort of edge highlight, though the Deathguard Green wasn't as much of a contrast as I had hoped against the camo green that I'd used before, so the edges weren't really popping like I wanted them to. Moving on to the more textured objects such as the hat or the rifle, I wasn't a fan of how the layering looked, so I switched out to a small stiff brush and applied the Deathguard Green as a dry brush. This helped give the weapon especially a rougher appearance and differentiate it slightly from the armour panels. I did however switch out to a softer makeup brush and go back over the armour to get a smoother colour transition and catch the more detailed sections. Macragge Blue next is a quick highlight to the masks that the Ogryns wear, just catching the edges at the top and the solid lines that run down the face piece. A few quick highlights can really make the models stand out on the battlefield. To finish the models, or so I thought, I added some Temple Guard Blue into the bionic eye lenses, choosing a cold blue to really stand out from the warmer, earthier tones of the model and give it an almost inhuman appearance. Once this blue had dried, I gave each lens a dot of matte white in the centre, which left them looking a little bit like this. There we are, a squad of 3 Ogryns ready to defend the Imperial cities of Garbachia in my ongoing 3rd edition Warhammer 40k campaign. Thank you to everyone who voted on the poll, the results of which you can see on the screen here. We have a tie between Poxwalkers and realistic Imperial Guard, and there was a really good suggestion for the Poxwalkers in the comments of that post. However, I can't find the right heads for them, and I'm not good enough at 3D sculpting to pull it off. So next week's video will be a 54mm scale guardsman for a potential Inquisitor warband. I'll put up a new poll shortly after this video is live, with some new options for the following video. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear what you think down in the comment section below, and I'll see you all next time.